The funny thing is, when people hear this story, they usually assume it started with a fence. It didn't. It started with a smile. A handshake. The kind of neighborly introduction that makes you think everything's going to be fine. 6 months later, that same handshake cost somebody several $1,000s and turned an entire backyard renovation into a very expensive lesson about property lines. Looking back now, I still laugh when I picture the expression on his face the day he realized I wasn't bluffing. But before we get there, I need to explain how all of this happened. My name's Ethan, and for over a decade I lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Cedar Ridge, a small town where everybody waved at each other but somehow still managed to know everybody else's business. My house sat on a corner lot with pale gray siding, an old wooden porch, and one thing I loved more than anything else, space. The backyard stretched farther than most yards in the neighborhood, bordered by a row of aging maple trees that had probably been there longer than half the houses on the block. There was no fence back there, never had been. Just open grass and a natural property line that everybody respected. For 11 years, nobody questioned where my land ended and someone else's began. Honestly, I barely thought about it myself. Life was simple. I worked, paid my mortgage, grilled burgers on weekends, and spent quiet evenings sitting on the porch watching the sun drop behind those maple trees. Then the house directly behind mine sold. At first I didn't think much of it. Houses changed hands all the time. A few weeks later a young couple moved in. Their names were Trevor and Melissa. They seemed successful, energetic, and determined to transform their new home into something straight out of a home improvement show. Within days there were contractors everywhere. New roof, new windows, new landscaping. Every morning I woke up to the sound of nail guns and construction trucks. I remember joking with my friend Danny one afternoon while we were drinking coffee on my porch. At this rate, they'll probably build a resort back there. Danny laughed and said, "Just wait until they put up a fence." That's when neighbor stories always start. At the time I thought he was kidding. Turns out he wasn't. About 2 weeks later, a fencing company showed up. Huge stacks of cedar panels were unloaded onto the driveway. Workers spent the entire day digging holes and setting posts. By evening, a brand new privacy fence wrapped around most of Trevor and Melissa's yard. I stood near my porch looking at it, and something felt off. I couldn't explain it immediately. The fence looked too close somehow. Not dramatically close. Just enough to trigger that little voice in the back of your head that says, something isn't right. I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. Angles can be deceptive. New structures make spaces feel different. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a measuring tape from the garage and walked out to the back corner of my property. There was a maple tree near the boundary that I'd measured years earlier when I was planning a garden project. I still remembered the distance almost exactly. 30 feet. That number had stuck in my head. I measured again. 22. I measured a second time. Same result. Then a third. 22. I stood there staring at the fence while my stomach slowly tightened. 8 feet. 8 entire feet of my backyard appeared to be sitting on the wrong side of that brand new fence. At first I honestly thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe the construction crew misread something. Maybe the survey markers were wrong. Maybe it was one of those simple misunderstandings that could be solved with a 5-minute conversation. So later that afternoon, I walked over and knocked on Trevor's door. He answered wearing work gloves and holding a cordless drill. I smiled and kept my tone friendly. "Hey, Trevor. I think there might be a problem with the fence placement." He looked confused. "What kind of problem?" I explained what I'd measured. I pointed toward the maple trees. I told him the fence appeared to be several feet inside my property line. He listened quietly, then shrugged. The contractor followed the survey stakes. "Can I see the survey?" I asked. "I don't have it with me," he replied. "But the contractor knows what he's doing." I nodded. "Would you mind double-checking before everything's finalized?" He glanced toward the fence and smiled. "Honestly, the job's already paid for, and it looks pretty good where it is." There wasn't anything openly hostile about the conversation, but there was something underneath it. A subtle dismissal. The kind that says, "I'm not really interested in hearing your side." I walked back home feeling uneasy. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was wrong. But if there was one thing I'd learned during 11 years of homeownership, it was that assumptions are expensive. Facts are cheap. And I intended to get facts. So 2 days later, I hired a licensed surveyor. What happened next would change everything. 2 days later, A surveyor named Richard pulled into my driveway just after sunrise. He was one of those guys who looked like he'd spent 40 years settling arguments people thought would never end. Quiet, methodical, not interested in opinions. Just measurements. I remember watching him unload equipment from his truck while Trevor's curtains shifted slightly across the yard. Somebody was definitely watching. Richard spent most of the morning walking the perimeter of my property, checking old markers, comparing county records, and taking measurements that meant absolutely nothing to me, but apparently meant everything to him. Around lunchtime, he finally waved me over. "Well," he said, looking down at his notes, "you weren't imagining it." I asked how bad it was. He pointed toward the fence. "About 8 feet. All the way across." Even though I'd expected that answer, hearing it officially still hit differently. 8 feet wasn't a minor error. It wasn't a contractor missing by a few inches. It was a massive section of land. Richard spent another hour placing bright orange survey flags along the actual property line. When he finished, the result was almost comical. Every single flag stood well inside Trevor and Melissa's shiny new fence. The visual made it impossible to deny. The fence wasn't near the boundary. It was nowhere close. I thanked Richard, paid the invoice, and spent the next hour taking photographs from every angle imaginable. Then I emailed everything to Trevor and Melissa. Survey documents, photos, property maps, a polite message explaining the situation and asking them to contact me so we could discuss a solution. Then I waited. 1 day passed. Nothing. 3 days. Nothing. A week. Still nothing. Not even a reply saying they received the email. That's when I started realizing this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a choice. They knew. They simply hoped I would let it go. The following Saturday, I walked over and knocked again. Trevor opened the door, and from the look on his face, I could tell he'd seen every document I sent. "Did you get my email?" I asked. "Yeah." "And?" He sighed heavily. "Look, moving that fence would cost thousands." I stared at him for a second. "So?" He shrugged. "You still have plenty of yard." To this day, I can still remember the exact feeling that hit me in that moment. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was disbelief. I actually laughed. "Are you seriously suggesting I give you part of my property because fixing your mistake would be inconvenient?" He crossed his arms. "I'm saying maybe we don't need to make a huge issue out of it." I pointed toward the fence. 8 feet isn't a huge issue." Another shrug. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "Fences end up a little off sometimes." A little off. 8 feet. I looked at him for a few seconds, waiting for a smile, waiting for some sign that he understood how ridiculous that sounded. Instead, he simply stepped backward. "I gotta get back to something." Then he closed the door. Right in my face. I walked home more calm than angry, which honestly surprised me. Usually when somebody treats me like that, I get irritated fast. This time I didn't. Because the moment that door closed, something became very clear. Trevor had made a calculation. He believed moving the fence would be expensive enough to discourage me. He believed I'd complain for a while, maybe threaten legal action, then eventually decide it wasn't worth the hassle. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't interested in spending years fighting over property lines in court. I was interested in solving problems. And sometimes solving problems requires creativity. That evening I started digging through county property records, deeds, easements, zoning documents, survey maps, every boring piece of paperwork associated with the neighborhood. Somewhere around midnight, I found something interesting. Very interesting. The land behind Trevor's fence was still mine. Legally, completely, unquestionably mine. The fence didn't change ownership. The fence didn't create rights. The fence didn't magically transfer property. In the eyes of the law, that strip belonged to me exactly as much as it had the day I bought the house. Which meant I could use it. Not damage anything. Not trespass. Not break laws. Just use my own land. The next morning I called a landscape contractor. Then another. By Wednesday, I had a plan. 2 weeks later, a truck rolled into my driveway carrying materials. Another truck followed. Then a compact excavator arrived. The reaction from next door was immediate. I was standing outside with a coffee when Melissa stepped onto their deck and stared at the equipment. 10 minutes later, Trevor appeared. 15 minutes later, both of them were watching from behind the fence. By noon, excavation had started. Workers carefully entered the disputed strip using temporary access points and began digging a series of deep holes along the true property line marked by Richard's survey stakes. Trevor couldn't stay quiet anymore. He marched over. "What's going on?" he demanded. I kept my voice calm. "Installing a structure." "Where?" I pointed at the ground. "On my property." His eyes shifted toward his fence, then toward the survey markers, then back to me. For the first time since this started, he looked nervous. "What kind of structure?" "You'll see." He didn't like that answer. The workers continued digging. Concrete forms arrived. Reinforcement materials arrived. By the end of the first day, several large steel posts had been installed. On the second day, more posts went in. 12 total. Thick. Permanent. Anchored deep into concrete. Neighbors began slowing their cars while driving past. One older woman walked her dog 3 times that afternoon and somehow managed to stop and observe the project during every single lap. People were curious. Trevor and Melissa were visibly stressed. I could feel it every time I looked toward their house. By the third day, the purpose of the project became obvious. Large custom-built wooden planter boxes were mounted between the steel supports. Each planter was enormous, 4 feet high, heavy-duty construction, designed to hold a significant amount of soil. Trevor came over again. "You're building planters?" "Yep." "Why?" I smiled. "I enjoy gardening." He knew that wasn't the whole answer. I knew he knew, but there wasn't much he could say. Everything sat entirely on my property. Every permit requirement had been checked. Every measurement had been verified. Every installation was legal. Over the following week, dozens of young bamboo plants arrived. Fast-growing varieties recommended by landscape specialists. The workers filled the planters with soil and carefully planted every stalk. At first the setup looked harmless, almost decorative. A few neighbors even complimented it. Trevor seemed relieved. I think he genuinely believed the project was over. What he didn't understand was that bamboo doesn't stay small for long, especially not the variety I selected. Spring turned into summer. The plants exploded upward. Every week, they grew taller, thicker, denser. Green shoots became walls of foliage. By mid-season, the bamboo stood higher than most people. By late summer, it formed a dense living screen stretching across the entire length of the disputed strip. The transformation was incredible. Unfortunately for Trevor, it was also devastating. His brand-new deck no longer overlooked an open yard. Instead, it faced a towering wall of bamboo. The afternoon sunlight that once reached his patio began disappearing. Sections of his expensive landscaping sat in shade. The backyard centerpiece he'd spent so much money creating suddenly felt enclosed and dark. One evening I sat on my porch with Danny drinking iced tea when he looked toward the bamboo and nearly choked laughing. "You actually did it." "Did what?" I asked. "Built the world's most polite revenge." I laughed. But the truth was more complicated. This wasn't revenge. Not really. Revenge would have been emotional. This was leverage. And deep down, Trevor knew it too. Because a few weeks later, he finally came knocking on my door. The knock came on a Thursday evening, just as I was finishing dinner. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Trevor stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking nothing like the confident guy who had shrugged off my survey report a few months earlier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the backyard and let out a long breath. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. "Sure." He rubbed the back of his neck and looked genuinely uncomfortable. "The bamboo is becoming a problem." I almost laughed at how carefully he chose those words. Becoming a problem. As if the problem had somehow appeared out of nowhere and wasn't directly connected to the giant wooden fence sitting 8 feet inside my property. "How so?" I asked. He stared at me for a second, probably realizing I was going to make him say it out loud. "It's blocking sunlight." "I see. The deck barely gets sun anymore." I nodded. "That's unfortunate. And Melissa's landscaping isn't doing well." "Also unfortunate." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. For a brief moment I thought he might get angry again, but instead his shoulders dropped. "Look, Ethan, is there any chance you'd consider removing it?" There it was. The question we'd both been heading toward for months. I leaned against the porch railing and looked out toward the row of bamboo, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The funny thing was, I actually liked it. It gave my yard privacy. The birds loved it. It looked pretty good from my side. But this had never been about landscaping. It had always been about boundaries. Literal boundaries. Respect. Accountability. The willingness to admit when you're wrong. I looked back at him and said, "Maybe." His eyes immediately lit up. "Really? Maybe?" I repeated. If the fence gets moved back to the actual property line, the excitement vanished from his face almost instantly. He knew exactly what that meant. Thousands of dollars. Contractor fees. Labor costs. Pride. Most of all, pride. We stood there quietly for a few seconds. Then he asked, "That's the only way?" I smiled. That's been the only way since the beginning. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He didn't tell me fences end up a little off sometimes. Instead, he nodded slowly, thanked me for my time, and walked back toward his house. 2 weeks later, I woke up to a sound that was somehow more satisfying than any argument I could have won. Power tools. I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and saw a fencing crew working behind Trevor's house. The same style of truck. The same kind of equipment. But this time they weren't building. They were undoing. Panel by panel, the fence came apart. Post by post, they pulled everything out of the ground. For 2 full days the crew worked while neighbors watched from sidewalks and driveways. Nobody said much, but you could feel the curiosity hanging in the air. Everybody knew something had happened. Everybody knew somebody had blinked first. By the end of the second day, the new fence stood exactly where it should have been from the beginning, directly along the surveyed property line. No missing feet. No questionable measurements. No borrowed land. Just the boundary that had always existed. The following weekend I kept my word. The planters came out. The bamboo was removed. The steel supports disappeared. Within days, sunlight returned to Trevor's backyard. His deck was open again. The landscaping recovered over time, and my yard regained the 8-foot strip that had never stopped belonging to me in the first place. The strangest part of the story came afterward. Once the fence was fixed, the hostility disappeared almost overnight. Trevor started waving again when we crossed paths. Melissa occasionally stopped to chat while walking the dog. We never became close friends, but we became something better than enemies. Maybe because the argument was finally over. Or maybe because everyone involved had learned something. I know I did. Before all of this happened, I used to think being a good neighbor meant avoiding conflict whenever possible. Now I think being a good neighbor means respecting other people's boundaries before conflict becomes necessary. Looking back, I don't feel proud because I won. I feel satisfied because I never had to scream, threaten, or drag anyone through a courtroom. I simply used the rights I already had and let reality do the negotiating for me. Still, every time I walk across that reclaimed section of grass, I remember the conversation where Trevor looked me in the eye and said 8 feet wasn't a big deal. Maybe that's the real reason this story sticks with me. Not because somebody built a fence in the wrong place, but because they genuinely believed convenience mattered more than ownership until the consequences landed in their own backyard. And honestly, that's the part one still think about sometimes. If I had simply accepted it, would they have ever admitted they were wrong? Or would that fence still be sitting there today? That's a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think the bamboo wall was exactly the lesson that needed to be taught? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor dispute that got completely out of hand, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.